Hello and welcome to Enchanted Rose Costumes. Today I'm going to be sharing with you how I made two festive themed gingerbread dresses for my girls for Christmas. I hope you enjoy! To make things easier for myself, I started off with a pattern that closely resembled my design. I then transferred my pattern onto craft paper with my tracing wheel, so I wouldn't have to worry about losing the multi-size from the pattern. This also makes it easier for me to alter things in the future without altering my base pattern. Now, the base pattern I was using did not have a collar piece, and I wanted to add one to my design. So to add a collar, I removed the seam allowance from my pattern pieces and then joined the pieces together on a new piece of craft paper and drew out my Peter Pan collar. You can see just how great I am at eyeballing it here. I then cut out that collar shape and then redrew it on another piece of paper and then added the seam allowance back to my collar piece for a nice clean pattern. Another design element I wanted was pleats on my yoke, so to do that I traced out a new yoke piece and then drew lines down it to show where I wanted my pleats to go. I then cut out strips of paper and added the amount of room I needed for each tuck. In this case, I wanted my finished tuck to be 1/4 of an inch, so I added 1/2 inch to each line I drew on my pattern. And then I taped everything back together and continued doing this until I had the amount of tucks I wanted on my yoke. Next, I had to return my yoke pattern to its original shape, and so I folded all my newly added tucks and then pushed them in the direction that they would be facing once they've been sewn, and trimmed off the excess paper until I had revealed my new yoke pattern. I then transferred this to a new piece of craft paper to create a nice clean pattern. You can kind of see here as I'm tracing out that I didn't completely follow the shape of my pattern pieces with the jagged points of the tucks. Now, the only reason I did that is because I knew I would be flatlining this to a yoke piece that did not have the tucks in it. If I was just creating this without flatlining to another piece, I would have followed it perfectly because otherwise it would have messed with the neckline. And finally, it's time to cut the pattern. The fabric I'm using is a 60-inch wide corduroy, and for both dresses, I used just over 2.5 meters. The front and back skirt, the back yoke, the sleeve, and the sleeve cuff tie piece, as well as the ruffle, were all cut out of the corduroy. And I just used a simple white quilters cotton for the front yoke and collar piece. Now, something I was taught in school was to cut the upper portion of my Peter Pan collar 1/4 of an inch wider on the outer curve. This way the collar has a nice clean curve when you understitch the under portion of the collar. And another tip from school was to double check your pattern before adding interfacing at the ironing board. I know I've done it many a time where I added the interfacing to a collar piece and I realized that it's slightly off grain or I've slightly tweaked it, and just having the pattern piece there helps you make sure that your collar is the correct shape. After ironing, I used my clapper to pull the heat away from my collar pieces and let it completely cool before moving it to make sure that the interfacing was properly bonded. With right sides together, I started stitching the center front of the collar with the upper portion of the collar on the bottom. This allowed me to ease in the collar. By pinning the ends together, I could see just how much I needed to ease the upper collar into the lower collar. And by pulling ever so slightly on the lower collar, the feed dogs were able to easily ease in the upper collar. I then graded and understitched the seam allowance to the under collar. And even before pressing, you can see how nicely the collar has come out with the understitching. I then sewed up the back edge of the collar and moved over to the iron. Before pressing the collar, I first graded the seam allowance. After using my point turner, I moved over to using my point presser, which if you have not seen this before, this is an amazing ironing tool. I find they're not really talked about a lot in the sewing world, and it is an amazing tool for getting really nice, clean, and crisp seams. I love my pressing tools. They make me so happy. And they make me even happier when I find them at the thrift store for super cheap, because they are not cheap when you buy them new. Going back to my collar, I steamed a slight curve in it on my tailor ham, and this is just so it'll lay nicer once it is sewn into the neckline. Using my heat-sensitive pen, I marked out all my tuck lines and then began pinning. Starting from the bottom up, I carefully sewed along my tuck lines. After sewing all my tucks, I moved over to the ironing board and pressed them all in the right direction. Next, using my rotary cutter and unpleated yoke, I trimmed away the excess fabric from my pleated yoke. And once that was done, I flatlined the pieces together so they were one. At this point, I felt the yoke was still missing something, so I dug through my stash and I found this lace and thought it would be a cute addition. With my pattern changes complete, it was finally time to start attaching the front and back yokes together. Originally, I was going to use French seams on this, but when it came to actually sewing it, I forgot about that until I'd already gotten too far to go back and change it. Next, I moved on to the back of the skirt, also forgetting about my French seam plan, and the shoulder straps of the dress. I then moved on to gathering the front and back portion of my dress where my yoke would later on be inserted. And then I matched all my marks and pinned my yoke into my dress. So I have really nothing to say about this part. I just gathered everything down until it fit. So I think I'm just gonna be quiet and let you listen to the nice music. So I don't know how many of you have this problem, but I have a horrible habit of putting my pins in backwards. When I'm pinning them, it makes sense that I am pinning them in one direction, but then when I get to the sewing machine, I realize I've put them in backwards again. At this point, I felt like my yoke was still slightly a little plain, so I said, what the heck, I still have extra lace. I'm just gonna add more lace. And here I'm just pressing a curve into my lace because I find it lays a lot nicer that way. After the lace had cooled, I then pinned it back to my yoke and sewed it in place. Next, with right sides together, I sewed in my facing. I then clipped and graded the seam allowance of my neckline and then understitched the facing to the seam allowance. I then installed a lapped zipper and pinned in my yoke facing. And using my trusty whip stitch, I hand sewed the facing to the yoke seam allowance. Remembering to use a French seam this time, I sewed up the side seams of the dress. Moving on to my sleeve, I stay stitched around the slash of the center of my sleeve. Then with right sides together, I stitched my slash facing along the stitching line I just created. I then clipped along my slash to the stitching line, trimmed the seam allowance, and flipped it to the inside and pressed. And then trimmed the facing down, folded under the raw edges, and pressed again. Then I whip stitched along the facing, making sure that my stitches were invisible from the front side of the fabric. Next, I sewed up the sleeves using a French seam. Moving on to the cuffs, I sewed the tie ends and left the center open so I could attach it to the bottom of the sleeve. Next, I pinned my cuff to my sleeve and sewed it in place. Next, I turned the cuff to the inside, pinned it in place, and sewed it down with a stitch in the ditch. I could have sewn this down by hand, but I was going for speed at this point. And then I tied the ends together with a square knot. With the sleeve finished, I gathered it up and then sewed it into the armhole. Moving on to my ruffle, I joined my 3.5 inch wide strips of corduroy with a French seam. To finish the raw edge of the bottom of the ruffle and reduce the amount of bulk in the hem, I opted for a Hong Kong finish. To do this, I cut 1.5 inch wide strips of cotton and sewed it right sides together, 1/4 inch away from the bottom of the ruffle. I then wrapped the cotton around the raw edge and edge stitched along my binding. I then pressed my hem up by 1/2 inch and sewed it in place. With my hem complete, I then moved on to gathering the upper edge of my ruffle. And from there, pinned the ruffle to the bottom edge of my gingerbread dress. Then going back to the sewing machine, I sewed my ruffles down. I also serged the edge so I wouldn't have to worry about the raw edges. And then from there, I top stitched the ruffle from the right side of the fabric. With the base of the dress now complete, it was time to give it that gingerbready look by adding some rickrack. Now, due to the size of my rickrack, it would have looked a lot more polished if I had followed the curves. However, I was opting for speed at this point and just sewed right down the center. And for a little pop of color, I sewed on 3 very sparkly buttons. And finally, to finish off the dress, I added a hook and eye at the top of the zipper. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I certainly had a lot of fun making these dresses. So this one's for my 2-year-old, which is what you saw in the video. And then this one is for my 1-year-old. So I'm really happy with how they turned out. The ruffles, like, ugh, the ruffle, I love things with ruffles. Ruffles are the best. I'm contemplating if I want to still add like little pockets with some more rickrack on it. But we'll see if I have time before Christmas. Yeah, we went to see Santa in our dresses, or my girls went and saw Santa in their dresses, and my 2-year-old managed to get chocolate on her collar, which I've already cleaned off, so it's all good. Yeah, but I love how they turned out, and oh, I had so much fun with these. Well, I would love to hear your thoughts on today's video in the comments down below. And also if you make themed outfits for your kids, or even for yourself. If you are new to my channel and you'd like to see more crazy adventures like this, just hit the subscribe button. I post 1 to 2 videos a month, depending on how elaborate everything is, so you won't have to worry about me flooding your subscription box. I think I still have 1 more video coming out before the end of the year, but if that doesn't get edited in time, I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I will see you in 2019. Bye!